Every town harbors a legend about someone who dared to push beyond the boundaries. That person might have ended up in prison, or perhaps they died, or maybe their mind simply never returned to what it once was. Such is the nature of life. But in this story of Tom Miller, a 38-year-old documentary filmmaker who is now but a panicked shadow of his former self, we shall learn that there is another fate, one far more terrifying, reserved for those who hold the rules in contempt. That fate is to encounter grotesque creatures that truly have no right to exist in this world. Through his own harrowing ordeal, Tom warns us to remain ever vigilant and to maintain an absolute respect for the moony people who reign within the deep canyons of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I am that Tom Miller, the man mentioned in that opening passage, and yes, I am now recounting the tragedy of my own life. If you were to look at me today, you would not recognize the 38-year-old man who was once overflowing with passion and a reckless, overbearing confidence. Currently, I am huddled in a small corner of a cramped and stifling apartment located in the heart of a noisy city, hundreds of miles away from those desolate forests shrouded in mist. My dwelling looks more like an isolated fortress or a cell for the insane than a normal home. Every window, from the living room to the kitchen, and from the bathroom to the bedroom, has been sealed by me with 3 layers of the thickest, darkest blackout curtains I could possibly find. Not a single ray of sunlight can pierce through the cracks, and, of course, no prying, sinister eyes from the outside can peer into this tiny, safe space of mine. To banish the darkness, which has now become the embodiment of the devil to me, the electric lights in the apartment are kept burning brilliantly and blindingly 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, regardless of whether it is day or night. I would rather pay exorbitant electricity bills than face the sheer terror of even a single light bulb accidentally burning out. The psychologists I desperately sought out for help all arrived at the same diagnosis, claiming I am suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder at an extremely severe level. They prescribed me countless sedatives, antidepressants, and offered hollow advice about practicing deep breathing or facing my fears. But how could they ever comprehend the true nature of the horror that has taken root deep within every cell of my body? They do not know that every time a wind happens to howl fiercely through the crevices of the building, or even at the sound of a very soft rustle of a dry leaf swept along the pavement below, cold sweat breaks out and drenches my forehead as if I had just experienced a horrific nightmare. In those moments, my heart feels as though it is being squeezed by an invisible hand, thumping and racing irregularly in my chest, making my breath ragged, hurried, and bitter in the back of my throat. I am always in a state of high alert, every muscle tensed, my eyes scanning the light-filled corners of the room just to find a false sense of reassurance. Those people living normal and stable lives, have no idea that I am constantly surrounded by an ultimate dread of the things silently lurking in the thick night, those freakish creatures that do not belong to this world of brilliant light. There was once a long period when I was an incredibly arrogant man, a self-important youth who always boasted that urban legends or spine-chilling folk tales passed down through generations were nothing more than cheap, nonsensical fabrications. I was convinced they were merely tools for adults to frighten naughty children who refused to listen, or a pile of hollow theories for the faint-hearted and superstitious. That overconfidence, combined with impulsive curiosity and a lack of respect for local culture, blindly urged me to pack my bags and hit the road. I craved sensational material to expose dark truths for my latest independent documentary project, never once imagining the steep price in my own mental health and lifelong peace that I was about to pay. It was that reckless and foolish journey that led me to a desolate, remote land where the laws of nature and the boundaries between the real world and the underworld were completely overturned and blurred. And it was in that gloomy place that I personally tore away the thin veil separating peaceful everyday reality from a cruel, eternal nightmare. Every tragedy in my life and every obsession eroding my mind every second and every minute originated from that fateful trip. My memory, though I have tried to suppress it, remains sharp, dragging me back to those distant days and forcing me to remember every shivering detail. It leads my mind back through time, away from this brightly lit apartment, to return to the very day everything began to shatter, a wrong decision that forever stripped away the peace in my soul and turned me into a hunted beast, a wretched prisoner living out his days within the remainder of his own life. Everything began on a brilliant autumn afternoon several years ago when I decided to drive my high-clearance vehicle away from the noisy pace of the city to venture deep into the pristine mountains known as the Blue Ridge. The original purpose of the trip, which seemed harmless and fueled by professional passion, was to collect precious oral history materials for my new documentary project. The main character I went to great lengths to find and interview was an old man named Silas Vance, who was 93 years old at the time. Silas was one of the rare living witnesses of a dark and exploitative historical period following the Civil War, when poor farmers, both white and people of color, had to work as sharecroppers, toiling endlessly on the land yet still not having enough to eat. I was eager to record his most authentic memories of the impoverished cotton fields, the hardships endured through gritted teeth since he was a child of 5, and a precarious life completely dependent on the weather and the mercy of cruel landlords. To make traveling easier, to have a quiet space to focus on work, and also to enjoy some fresh air, I decided to stay at a remote log cabin that my grandparents had purchased decades ago as a vacation retreat. It was a place tucked away on the side of a steep hill, completely isolated from the civilized world outside, so quiet that even mobile signals or global positioning signals gradually vanished as I drove higher. The road to the house was a winding gravel slope with no protective railings, so precarious that just a moment of inattention could send a car plunging straight into the valley. The house had 2 floors and a basement filled with old belongings, with the second floor being an open space flooded with large floor-to-ceiling glass windows facing the outside world. But what made this cabin special, possessing a sinister beauty and also being the source of my horrific nightmare later on, lay in its strange construction site. The back of the house, with a large wooden balcony running along its perimeter, was built precariously right at the edge of a massive canyon that my family always referred to as the Abyss. Standing on the balcony and looking down, you would only see a deep void formed by the subsidence of the Earth's crust, thick with the interwoven canopies of ancient trees, so dark and damp that even the most brilliant sunlight of a summer noon could hardly penetrate down to the bottom, filled with dry branches and fallen leaves. When I was a child, my cousins and I were strictly forbidden by the adults from going anywhere near the railing for fear that we would slip and fall into that giant mouth, more than 6 meters deep, which sat gaping, waiting to swallow everything. Back then, the abyss was to me merely a physical danger, a distant steep cliff that curious children believed if crossed would reveal wild and mysterious caves. I used to stand on that windswept balcony, breathing in the musky scent of rhododendrons and wild grass, feeling immensely peaceful amidst the vastness of nature. Now, looking back, I realize with a shiver that the stillness enveloping that canyon was not the peace of Mother Nature embracing humanity, but rather the bloodthirsty bated breath of something malicious silently stalking in the deep shadows. The absolute isolation of the cabin, which seemed like an earthly paradise for an artist like me who loved quiet, turned into a perfect mousetrap that snapped shut to imprison me, surrendering me to hideous ancient forces that had slept beneath the black depths of the abyss since before the first trails were blazed through these mountains by man. I had naively walked into their sacred and forbidden territory with the mocking attitude of someone taking a stroll in a park, never suspecting that every crunching footstep on the gravel, every breath, and every arrogant glance of mine was being closely watched from deep within the thick mist below, initiating a punishment from which I would never have the chance to escape. After settling my luggage at the cabin perched on the edge of the abyss, I took my specialized recording equipment and drove to Silas' house. His home sat nestled in a remote valley, surrounded by trees rustling in the autumn wind. At first, the interview proceeded very smoothly with stories of poverty and the harshness of farming life, providing me with the historical data just as I had expected. Silas, with the gravelly voice of a man who had tasted enough of life's bitterness, slowly told me about the long days spent with his back to the scorching sun to harvest crops, about meals that consisted of only a few potatoes to stave off hunger, and the precariousness of depending entirely on the mercy of nature as well as greedy landlords. I listened intently and thought to myself that my documentary project would surely be a resounding success with these authentic clips. However, that cozy and reminiscent atmosphere abruptly changed when I curiously pressed for more information about Silas' family members. The rare smile on the old man's lips vanished, replaced by a tense expression and an evasive gaze staring fixedly at the door. The space in the small living room seemed to grow thick and colder. Old. Silas suddenly became very quiet, his wrinkled hands trembling as they gripped the armrests of the chair, and then he hesitantly spoke of his late younger brother named Arthur. His voice dropped, carrying a sorrow and fear that seemed still intact despite decades having passed. Silas recounted that Arthur had suddenly disappeared on a thick, misty autumn night when the boy was only 10 years old. The entire family and the local residents had lit torches and rushed to search every nook and cranny of the mountain in utter desperation. Finally, all their hopes were completely extinguished when the poor boy's cold body was found floating in a dark stream at the very bottom of the valley a few days later. The way the old man hesitated when mentioning his brother's death and the haunting look in his eyes as he stared at the dense forest outside the window sent an invisible chill down my spine, signaling horrific secrets still buried beneath the peaceful facade of these rugged mountains. I assumed it was a tragic drowning accident and lowered my voice to offer comfort, but Silas suddenly looked up at me with bloodshot eyes and firmly insisted that Arthur did not drown. In a whisper as cold as a razor blade, the old man said that his younger brother had paid with his life simply because the foolish boy dared to break the ancient laws of this mountain. While I was still bewildered, not understanding what the old man was implying, Silas began to mention a name that even now, just thinking about it, is enough to freeze the blood in my veins, and that is the Mooney people. According to his fragmented and terrified account, they are an incredibly bizarre and ancient species that has existed lingeringly within the deep caves since long before humans set foot on this land. They possess small, stunted forms with skin as white and pale as a waterlogged corpse, and most notably, a freakish face without eyeballs, having only two deep, black, hollow sockets, and they are extremely vengeful and cruel to any who dare to profane their territory at night. The temperature in the living room suddenly dropped so much that I could feel the bone-chilling cold brushing against my neck as Silas leaned forward and gripped my wrist tightly. With an extremely serious and panicked demeanor, the old man gritted out every word to deliver a chilling warning that if you see something, act as if you saw nothing, and if you hear a sound, act as if you heard nothing, never be allowed to run, and absolutely never turn your head to look back. Utter terror seemed to have seized the mind of the old sharecropper, making him lose the polite decorum of a host. As the dim light of twilight began to descend, casting a somber hue over the dense trees outside the window, Silas suddenly stood up and hurriedly waved me out of his house, demanding that I leave immediately as dusk began to fall. He firmly slammed the old wooden door behind me, leaving me standing frozen among the fallen leaves, carrying a jumble of curiosity mixed with the slight annoyance of an arrogant outsider who had never known what it meant to be afraid. Having been politely ushered out of Silas' house as darkness began to swallow the last rays of sun, I sullenly started my vehicle and drove back to my family's cabin perched on the edge of the abyss. Contrary to the old sharecropper's extreme panic, there was not a single spark of fear within me at that time, but instead, an overwhelming surge of excitement. The instinct of a keen reality documentary filmmaker told me that I had just struck a gold mine of material, a sensational folk legend full of eerie spiritual colors that promised a resounding success for my upcoming work. As soon as I stepped into the quiet space of the cabin, I threw my coat onto the sofa and self-indulgently uncorked an expensive bottle of red wine to celebrate my good fortune. Under the yellow light, I took a light sip of the tart wine and then stretched out on the comfortable armchair, opened my laptop, and began to mockingly type search queries about the legend of the Mooney people on the internet. The results that appeared only made me more amused as they described exactly what Silas had said, plus a few crude stone statues said to be relics left by the Cherokee Indians centuries ago. In my tipsy state and the ultimate arrogance of an outsider, I grabbed my mobile phone and dialed the number for Sarah, my colleague and effective partner in the city. Stepping out onto the windswept, dark porch right at the edge of the deep abyss, I took a deep puff of a strong cigarette and spoke incessantly to her about the absurd story I had just collected. I loudly mocked the panicked face of old Silas, considering his hair-raising warnings as nothing more than the pathetic psychological remnants of a backward historical period full of superstition. On the other end of the line, Sarah, with her naturally cautious character, repeatedly spoke up to dissuade me, advising me not to mock long-standing folk beliefs in this remote mountain region because, after all, I was there alone in the middle of the silent night. But overbearing pride had completely clouded my reason, making me confidently boast that I was standing at the peak of modern civilization, completely immune to those cheap ghost stories meant to scare children. I laughed out loud, drowning out the sound of the mountain wind that was howling, and quickly brushed aside my colleague's excessive worry. I told Sarah assertively that the thing with the round face and hollow eyes was just a way for Karens in the old days to threaten children not to stay out late or to forbid them from nearing dangerous caves. Nonchalantly hanging up, I continued to stand precariously, leaning against the thin wooden railing, exhaling plumes of white smoke into the pitch-black and cold space that sat hungrily waiting right beneath my feet. I sipped the last bit of wine in my glass, enjoying the satisfaction of a successful sensationalist newsgatherer, smiling smugly at the eerie atmosphere of the mountain without knowing that every arrogant mockery echoing into the cliff walls in the night had just accidentally broken a centuries-old taboo, awakening a pack of invisible beasts sleeping at the very bottom of that deep, yawning canyon. Putting the phone in my pocket after heartlessly brushing off Sarah's worried advice, I slowly turned around to face the deep night enveloping the canyon directly. The buzz from the expensive wine combined with the triumphant feeling of someone who considers himself superior had completely obscured the little reason left in my brain. My footsteps staggered, sounding dry, rhythmic thuds on the wooden floor of the balcony as I approached the thin railing, the final boundary separating the safety of the porch light and the deep, black abyss gaping below. I lit another cigarette, taking a very deep puff to let the smoke fill my lungs, then slowly exhaled into the air, enjoying the freezing cold of the desolate mountains caressing my skin. The stillness of the forest at this time should have made anyone shudder with unease, but for an arrogant man yearning to prove his mettle like me, it was like a perfect stage devoid of an audience. Provoked by the heavy fumes of alcohol rising to my head and a desire to strike a final mocking blow at the heap of nonsense legends Silas had told, I leaned both hands on the wooden railing, leaned forward, and exhausted the strength in my throat to scream a greeting that echoed down into the infinite void below. My scream tore through the night, sharp and piercing, carrying all the disdainful arrogance of a blasphemer. However, contrary to everything defined by the laws of physics, the sound striking those massive cliff walls did not create any echoing sound in return. My greeting was swallowed instantly by a giant black hole at the bottom of the abyss, disappearing without leaving even a faint ripple of sound. At the same time, an incredibly eerie and irrational phenomenon occurred that made my half-smile freeze instantly on my lips. The mountain winds, which had been howling powerfully, blowing dry leaves and making tree branches bang repeatedly against the roof, abruptly stopped in the blink of an eye. There was no gradual deceleration, nor were there any lingering breezes. Everything suddenly plunged into a state of absolute, deathly silence. A stifling, thick, and heavy silence like lead immediately descended to envelop the entire vast forest, suffocating the sound of crickets, frogs, and the familiar rustling of night insects. The air around me seemed to be sucked dry, becoming thin and hollow, making me instinctively gasp for breath, feeling a clear, invisible pressure weighing on my eardrums as if I had just dived deep into the ocean. Standing alone on the precarious balcony with a half-burned cigarette in my hand, I suddenly realized I had just done something incredibly stupid. The cold sensation running down my spine was no longer due to the weather, but the most primitive human instinct screaming in alarm about an extreme danger close at hand. The abnormal silence of the canyon was not a random natural phenomenon, but a cold, cruel answer to my insolent challenge. It drew a stark boundary between the world of humans and some dark, gloomy realm that I had never known. That was the fateful moment marking the time when the arrogant city boy named Tom Miller had officially crossed the red line, blatantly and violently violating the ancient taboos of this sacred mountain. I did not know that my reckless scream had served as a fateful key to fling open the gates of hell, awakening freakish entities that always craved the warmth of life, which were now slowly turning their empty eye sockets up from the deep caves to aim directly at the blasphemer standing exposed under the brilliant lights above. Amidst that stifling, breathless silence, my eyes remained fixed down on the dark abyss, and then from the balcony, I spotted a pale speck of light slowly moving at the bottom of the canyon. Initially, my mind tried to cling to the thin sliver of scientific reason left, deluding myself into thinking it was just a deer or wild buck wandering to forage in the night. However, as I tried to strain my eyes to see that dim light clearly, I realized the way it moved was entirely contrary to the laws of nature. It did not walk on four legs nimbly like wild animals, but the way it moved on two legs in a slow and distorted manner sent a freezing chill running along my spine. Every step of that thing was hauntingly rhythmic, emitting a faint white light like a membrane enveloping a freakish living entity. The false sense of security brought by the alcohol was blown away in an instant without a trace, giving way to the most primitive dread clawing at my soul. I stood frozen in place, holding my breath, my hands gripping the wooden railing so hard that my knuckles turned white, not daring to make even the slightest noise, my eyes glued to the figure wandering below. That freakish speck of light continued to linger leisurely at the bottom of the abyss. For a few more breaths, and then that creature slowly vanished into the cliff face right beneath the cabin where I was standing. That thing had completely disappeared from my sight, swallowed by the thick shadows of the canyon, but the feeling of being stalked and besieged became even more distinct and horrific than ever. After that bizarre light dove into the rock wall beneath my feet, I staggered back a few steps, trying to gather the last bit of courage to calm myself. My trembling legs could no longer stand firm, forcing me to let myself collapse into the familiar wooden rocking chair placed on the porch. I closed my eyes tight, burying my face in my cold hands, murmuring words of comfort to deceive myself that it was all just a hallucination created by the alcohol and the dark. The steady creaking of the rocking chair, which used to be a sound that lulled me to sleep on peaceful summer nights, had now become a countdown rhythm for a horrific event about to strike. Suddenly, from deep within the thick darkness of the abyss, a skin-crawling whisper rose up, tearing through the silent space, calling my name precisely. Tom. That sound lingered, every syllable stretched out in a forced, mournful, and sorrowful way that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up in unison. It was nothing like the cry of any wild animal but bore the deep tonal quality of a human suffering through extreme pain, sounding pleading and urgent as if desperately begging for my help. My heart felt as though it was being squeezed by an invisible hand, thumping and racing continuously, feeling as though it might burst out of my chest at any moment. I sat motionless, as stiff as a stone statue, not daring to breathe heavily, letting the cigarette ash fall onto the back of my hand, burning and stinging. My brain screamed reminders of Silas' warning that if you hear a sound, act as if you heard nothing. Time passed, every second heavy as a century, as I determinedly kept my mouth shut, not daring to utter even a response or a heavy breath. And then, as if sensing my silent resistance, the attitude of the thing lurking below changed instantly. The call no longer bore the weak, pleading quality, but suddenly became rapid, sharp, and filled with a seething anger. Those calls of my name were now torn apart, screamed savagely and echoing continuously from all over the cliff walls, resounding from many different directions of the canyon as if countless invisible creatures were simultaneously aiming their curses at me. That chaotic and demonic mess of sounds besieged me, spiraling into my eardrums and ruthlessly crushing every thin psychological defense I had just tried to build, pushing me to the very edge of total madness. Extreme panic surrounded me, completely breaking my last bit of patience and endurance, causing me to lose self-control as I suddenly bolted upright, knocking over the small wooden table next to the rocking chair and creating a clattering crash that shattered the silence. The ashtray and the glass wine cup fell with a clatter, shattering and spraying shards across the porch floor, but I no longer had the mind to care or be startled by the mess. Because my gaze was now locked onto the opposite cliff, only a pitch-black void of the deep canyon away from me. Right there, lurking between the gaunt, spindly trees rising in the night, I saw that demonic entity clearly in its true form, with a small, stunted, punched, and freakish humanoid stature. Its naked skin was bone-white and pale like a corpse soaked in water for days, emitting a morbid, dim light in the middle of the thick darkness, but what terrified me to the point that the blood in my veins froze was its perfectly round, smooth face that lacked a nose or mouth, possessing only two deep, black, hollow eye sockets as soulless as two tunnels leading straight to hell. That small, grotesque body did not stand still. It was slowly walking on two legs, moving in a straight line, parallel to the opposite cliff edge, and the ultimate horror was that it did not bother to look down at the path of dirt and rock but kept twisting its neck in an irrational way to point that evil face directly at me, staring without blinking. Those empty eye sockets seemed to possess a horrific, malevolent magic, pinning my soul and transmitting a deathly, bone-chilling sensation, clearly signaling that it had marked me as the hopeless prey of the night. The nightmare manifested right before my eyes made the most primitive survival instinct within me scream violently, urging my legs to immediately turn around and run for my life from this damn balcony to find safe shelter inside the thick wooden walls of the house. But at the exact moment I was about to lift my heel to bolt, the gravelly, horrific, and pleading voice of old Silas from earlier that afternoon suddenly resounded in my mind like a final death knell, reminding me of a life-and-death law of this mountain, that you must absolutely not run. Now I understood to the very core the extreme dread of that old man when telling of his ill-fated 10-year-old brother, Arthur, who perhaps also once stood frozen in some desolate place on this mountain, directly facing a demonic gaze like this, and then that poor boy, because he was too panicked, made the fatal mistake of running to hide, only to never have the chance to see the sunlight ever again. I gritted my teeth so hard that bitter blood seeped into my mouth, telling myself I must use all the thin will left to shackle my trembling legs, forcing myself to stand still and endure the confrontation with the hunter from the abyss, because I knew all too well that just one cowardly turn of the back now, and the highest price I would pay would be my own life. The empty gaze of that evil creature pinned me down like sharp drills, piercing through the fake layer of courage I had just tried to build, forcing me to bite my lip until it bled to suppress a frantic scream about to burst from my tightening throat. My mind screamed orders for my legs to lift off the wooden floor, but I knew that if I turned back now, the agitation would immediately turn me into a weak prey fleeing in panic, and that thing would surely not miss the chance to hunt me to the end. I moved millimeter by millimeter with very slow and cautious backward steps, sliding my heels stealthily on the wooden planks of the porch while my eyes remained wide and glued to the bone-white figure emitting that eerie, pale light on the other side of the deep abyss. Each backward step was an ultimate torture of the spirit as I felt its invisible claws stretching out through the air, ready to grab my collar and pull me down into the black canyon. Finally, my back, drenched in cold sweat, touched the cold glass surface of the sliding door leading into the living room, bringing a thin spark of hope for survival. My hands were trembling so uncontrollably that I had to fumble clumsily for several seconds before I could grab the slippery door handle and pull it hard, sliding it across the metal track with a screeching sound. As soon as my body slipped inside the warm space of the house, I immediately used all my strength to press the glass door shut and slammed the safety latch, creating a dry click that resonated like a thunderous pardon in the middle of the night. However, the reassurance lasted less than a second before another fear struck me down when I realized with horror that the entire first-floor design of this cabin was an open space with giant transparent glass windows stretching from the ceiling to the floor. Right now, I was no different from a fish swimming in a glass tank filled with lights, exposing all my actions and ultimate fear for that hideous creature to freely admire from outside the thick night. A frantic panic exploded in my chest, urging me to dash like a madman, tripping over cluttered furniture to hurriedly tear down every curtain on the ground floor. I pulled hard on the ribbons tying the curtains, slamming the dark fabrics shut to cover the living room area, then rushed into the small, angled kitchen to yank down the roller blinds to the window sills, before staggering and falling toward the dining area to pull the last screens to block the view from outside. Despite having created a barrier of fabric enveloping the entire first floor, the stifling atmosphere and the creeping sensation on the back of my neck did not diminish at all, making me certain that this thin boundary was not enough to stop a grotesque ancient entity. Without hesitating for another heartbeat, I dragged my legs, which felt as soft as noodles, and rushed toward the wooden stairs in the corner of the house, frantically climbing the steps two at a time, slipping and banging my knees against the sharp wooden edges multiple times, but I no longer felt any pain. The only destination in my mind right now was the master bedroom on the second floor, which I considered the safest and most secluded lair of the house. As soon as I pushed the door open and entered the room, I immediately locked the door from the inside using every available lock, from the thumb turned to the safety chain, then leaned back against the thick wooden door, gasping for breath continuously. Even though my body was sheltered behind layers of locked doors, fear still throttled my heart, forcing me to frantically slap the switches on the wall, turning on all the lighting devices in the bedroom from the high-power ceiling light to the golden chandelier, the two bedside lamps, and even the standing reading lamp in the corner. The room immediately became brilliantly, even blindingly bright, dispelling the gloomiest corners, bringing me a blind confidence that the creature accustomed to living in deep, dark caves would surely be terrified and never dare to approach such destructive sources of light. I curled into a ball on the large mattress, my hands clutching the mobile phone which still had a few final percentages of battery, my eyes wide and staring fixedly at the closed wooden door, trembling and praying for time to pass quickly so that the morning sunlight could bring life back and redeem my sinful soul. Although I promised myself to keep my eyes wide to watch over my safety, the long, dragging tension and the terror had drained my last bit of vitality, causing me to fall into a fitful sleep before I knew it. The shallow, dream-filled sleep was cruelly interrupted when I suddenly jolted awake at 3 in the morning and realized with horror that the entire room around me was now as pitch black as ink. My heart dropped straight to my stomach when I discovered that all the brilliant chandeliers, table lamps, and reading lamps I had carefully turned on as a protective shield had been completely turned off, even though the display of the digital clock on the bedside table was still showing the time, proving the electrical system had not failed. An invisible and eerily quiet intrusion had crept into my safest lair while I was at my most distracted. A chill spread through my nervous system, making my body go stiff as my eyes darted toward the small balcony. On the second floor, and I saw a horrific truth that made my breath catch in my throat. The thick curtains that I had personally pulled shut to block any view from the outside had now been pulled wide to both sides by someone. The only light present in the room now was not warm lamplight but a cold, pale moonlight slowly filtering through the transparent glass door, casting eerie streaks of light into the corner of the bed where I was huddled in defense. The sense of security brought by the locked doors was immediately torn away, replaced by a dark despair surrounding me, signaling that those ancient evil creatures were not just out in the abyss but had actually found a way to neutralize every barrier, reaching out invisible tentacles of death into my private space. The panic throttled my lungs, making me feel as if I couldn't inhale another breath of oxygen in the bedroom that was sinking in thick, cold darkness. The pale moonlight shining through the balcony glass frame was like a sharp blade slicing through the space, illuminating the cruel truth that the safety barriers I had believed in had completely collapsed. Driven by an extraordinary survival effort fueled by ultimate dread, I fumbled with my trembling, sweat-drenched hands toward the oak bedside table and grabbed the mobile phone, which was clinging to its last bit of battery, to turn on the faint, blinding flashlight. The weak, artificial white beam immediately became a thin lifebuoy, salvaging a bit of residual courage in my frantic mind. Holding the phone to light the way, I gritted my teeth until my jaw ached, recklessly dashing out of the warm bed toward the balcony glass frame with the curtains open, with the sole intention of slamming that fabric barrier shut as quickly as possible before anything could get inside. My bare footsteps thudded frantically on the cold wooden floor, the rhythmic sounds echoing crudely and disjointedly in the silent night of the desolate mountains. My breath came in gasps, exhaling faint white mist against the cold glass. As my body rushed to the edge of the transparent glass door, some invisible force filled with deadly prompting forced me to glance down at the porch on the ground floor, and in that horrific split second, my heart seemed to stop completely, my chest tightening with pain as if pierced by thousands of poison needles at once. Under the dim and haunting light of the crescent moon hanging high above, I saw a scene that would forever be etched into my cerebral cortex, devastating my nervous system and haunting my every dream until the day I closed my eyes. That evil creature with its small, stunted form and freakish, glowing white skin was no longer lurking at the bottom of the deep abyss or wandering on the opposite cliff edge as before it had climbed up onto my porch. It stood tall and motionless right at the position of the wooden rocking chair where, only a few hours ago, I had sat arrogantly with my legs crossed, sipping expensive wine, blowing thick smoke, and loudly uttering blasphemous words against the ancient laws of the mountain. The distance between me and the embodiment of nightmare had now narrowed significantly, separated only by the vertical space from the second floor to the ground. It did not move its gaunt, spindly body, nor did it make any small sound, but its presence emitted a stifling aura of death so intense it felt as though the window glass might crack into pieces. With a stiff and irrational body movement, completely contrary to the biological structure of any animal ever recorded, that thing slowly raised its round, smooth head that lacked a nose or mouth. Directly and very clearly under the cold moonlight, its empty eyes, which were only two deep, black, soulless sockets, were looking up directly at my bedroom window where I stood frozen like a stone statue, suffering my punishment. Its gaze bore no pupils, no whites, not even a spark of life, yet it was like invisible, sharp hooks, piercing through the glass, through my weak layers of flesh, and pinning themselves deep into my soul. It knew exactly where I was hiding in this large cabin. It had silently followed my every pathetic fleeing step from the first floor to the second, and now it stood there in the silent moonlight like a cruel death sentence for the foolish outsider who dared to provoke the wrath of the Mooney people. The feeling of having my territory blatantly violated, of having every fortified barrier stripped away and being locked as a target by an entity that did not belong to the world of the living, made my brain completely paralyzed. All concepts of time and space seemed to freeze permanently, leaving only a silent, bone-chilling confrontation between an arrogant human sinking in the swamp of despair and an ancient, hideous force leisurely savoring the ultimate fear of its small prey. The moment of facing the empty, malevolent gaze of that grotesque creature directly had completely collapsed the last bit of survival will that had flared up within me. The paralysis released my tensed muscles, giving way to a violent psychological shock that made me jump, escaping the nightmare currently manifesting in reality. With the struggling reflex of a drowning man, I used what strength I had left to grab the edge of the thick curtain and used all my might to pull it shut to both sides, hiding the transparent glass door and the pale, freakish face looking up at me under the cold moonlight. Darkness once again fell upon the room, but this time it did not bring a sense of security. Instead, it held a stifling atmosphere as suffocating as a closed tomb. I staggered back, tripping on the edge of the rug and falling headlong toward the large mattress. No longer caring about anything, I crawled onto the bed and retreated to the very corner of the room, curling my large 38-year-old man's body into a pathetic, trembling heap, clutching my knees and burying my face between my sweat-drenched arms. The feeling of being brutally violated in my own space tormented my mind as I knew all too well that just a thin wooden floor and a few lifeless walls away, that creature not belonging to the world of the living was standing right there on my porch. Every fortified barrier, every secure lock system, and every brilliant light I once deluded myself into thinking was impenetrable was now just a meaningless joke before the demonic power of that ancient species. They had easily extinguished all the lights in the room from afar, pulled wide the curtains I had carefully closed, and proudly stepped out of the black abyss to enter my living space as an ostentatious punishment for my insolent arrogance a few hours prior. Shame mixed with ultimate dread squeezed my heart, forcing salty tears to flow from my stinging eyes. I sobbed in waves but had to bite my lip until it bled, trying to swallow the sobs back into my throat, not daring to make even the smallest whimper for fear that the thing was still pricking up its ears to listen to every movement of its prey. The long night passed in ultimate dark despair, every second and every minute dragging like a century, torturing my every nerve which was as taut as a wire. I just lay there huddled and crying in silence, listening to my heart thumping wildly in my chest, counting my own weak breaths, and desperately praying to any almighty deity to bring the sunlight back. Fear had completely swallowed me, turning me into a hollow shell without any courage left, until the first brilliant golden rays of dawn began to seep through the thin cracks of the curtains, signaling a humiliating survival after a long night filled with horrific obsession. When the first pale yellow rays of dawn struggled through the thin cracks of the bedroom curtains to illuminate the cold corner of the wall, I finally dared to believe I had truly survived the most horrific night in my 38 years of life. My large body was now stiff and aching after many hours of huddling in a defensive posture, but the powerful instinct for survival immediately bolstered me up from the crumpled, sweat-soaked mattress. My eyes were swollen, bloodshot, and stinging, but I had no mind to care about my own pathetic appearance because the only desire screaming in my brain was to flee from this earthly hell as quickly as possible. I clumsily grabbed my travel backpack, stuffing a few clothes, personal items, and the mobile phone that had just been charged with a sliver of battery into it, my hands trembling so much I dropped my car keys on the floor several times. Not bothering to care about the expensive recording equipment or the precious materials for the documentary, I hurriedly undid the series of safety locks on the wooden bedroom door and rushed into the hallway like a madman. My bare feet thudded hurriedly on the wooden stairs. I jumped 2 steps at a time, only wishing to reach the exit quickly to jump into the car, start the engine, and leave this cursed mountain. However, as soon as my heels touched the floor of the ground level, A horrific sight struck my eyes, causing all the blood in my body to freeze, my heart rate, which had just stabilized a bit, once again racing in panic. Last night's nightmare was not a delusional dream spun by my mind, it was a cruel and naked reality that strangled every last illusion of safety. The entire first-floor space was now flooded with brilliant sunlight, exposing a disgusting truth: all the ribbons and dark curtains covering the living room, the kitchen, and even the dining table that I had frantically slammed shut and locked last night had now been opened wide to both sides in a neat and deliberate manner. A freezing chill from the soles of my feet rose straight to the top of my head as my eyes darted to the heavy oak front door leading out to the gravel path. The thumb turn and the sturdy deadbolt, which I remembered clearly locking in 2 layers right after returning from the interview with old Silas, were now both wide open, and the door was even slightly ajar, letting cold mountain winds blow inside the house. A feeling of nausea surged to my throat as I realized the true meaning behind this quiet scene of disarray. Those creatures with smooth faces and deep, black, hollow eye sockets, were not stopped by brilliant lights or locked glass doors, and they did not just stalk on the porch or the edge of the abyss. While I was locking myself away, hiding and crying pathetically in the second-floor bedroom, those hideous and evil entities had nonchalantly picked the locks, stepped inside my home, strolled around the living room, and lingered right under the floor where I lay huddled to deliver a silent, cruel message for the moony people who reign over these mountains. There is no barrier or sanctuary of mankind that can protect the insolent outsiders who dare to speak blasphemy against them. Casting aside all thoughts of gathering my scattered belongings, I bolted out the open door, gripping the key in my hand like a final lifebuoy. I lunged into the driver's seat and locked all the windows before my trembling hands fumbled to shove the key into the ignition, fleeing down the mountain's sloping road. When the first signal bar flickered on the phone screen, I hurriedly dialed old Silas' number with a desperate longing to talk about the horrific event that had just occurred, to find some sympathy. The other end picked up, but as I began to stammer out hints of last night's experience, the only response I received was a heavy, weary sigh, and then Silas coldly hung up, leaving me drifting with the soulless dial tone. Now I understood thoroughly why the people here choose to remain in absolute silence before forces that do not belong to the world of men. Returning to the gloomy reality of my curtained apartment, I confirm once more that immediately after that fateful trip, I sold the cabin for whatever I could get, moved far away, and swore never to set foot in North Carolina ever again. My tragic story closes as a profound warning to everyone: always know how to fear and respect the darkness before the darkness heartlessly swallows you. Through what I have experienced, we can draw a costly life lesson and a deep human value regarding the humility of man before the vast universe. We are often arrogant, thinking that the light of civilization can explain and master everything, but the vastness of nature and the folk beliefs passed down through centuries always contain their own deep reasons for survival. Never trample upon or blaspheme against taboos, because sometimes those seemingly irrational oral stories are the last thin barrier protecting us from the silent underworld. Learn to respect differences and invisible boundaries, for we are but small creatures living alongside mysteries that have never been exposed. Dear viewers, how do you feel about today's story? Does the protagonist's horrific experience remind you of any legends or spiritual taboos in your own real life? We are very eager to hear your sincere feelings from deep within your hearts, so please do not hesitate to share your thoughts and comments below. If you enjoy this content, please support us by subscribing to the channel, hitting like, and sharing so we can listen to many more fascinating and dramatic videos updated by us every day. Before closing the program, we sincerely wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful and peaceful life, and abundant happiness every day. Goodbye, and see you all in the next video. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.